Europe was prepared for war in 1914, but just not the kind of war that the Great War would rapidly turn into. A static war, a trench war, where trench warfare dominated. In this episode, we ask, why was there trench warfare in the First World War? As we move into season 7 of the Old Frontline podcast, I wanted to bring in another new aspect of what we do here on the Old Frontline. Last season, we had dispatches, the shorter podcasts, and also the question and answer bonus episodes, and both of those will, of course, continue. But one element that I wanted to bring in, which is kind of inspired by the sort of questions that are coming into the podcast, is a kind of how and why podcast, a series of those looking at different aspects of First World War history and asking how and why those things happened. And we'll begin with this episode by asking a principal question and then go on, I hope, to answer it. And that question is, why was there trench warfare in the First World War? Now, trench warfare is something that dominates the collective memory of that conflict. If you asked anybody in the street who knows almost nothing about the Great War, tell me something that you know, they would respond with something about trenches. The images that we have taken by official photographers showing conditions in the trenches, the mud and the muck and the slime, the close nature, that kind of troglodyte world of the trenches that I often talk about here on the podcast. This is what really dominates, I think, the collective memory of it. So in a war so dominated by that memory of trenches, were trenches an integral part of what the war was meant to be from the beginning? Was there a plan to have this kind of trench warfare? Or if that wasn't the case, what led to it and how did those armies adapt? Did they already know how to do it? And we'll ask a whole host of kind of questions around that subject, hopefully shining some light on this key aspect of not just the war on the Western Front, because there was static warfare in Salonika, where trenches were dug there, static warfare in Mesopotamia, where we were fighting the Ottoman Turks, and there were a kind of trench warfare in Palestine, and also almost a replicant of the Western Front happened at Gallipoli in 1915, where failing to land and get off those beaches in the early stage of the operations led to static trench warfare. So where do we begin then with the story of trenches? Are trenches unique to the First World War? If we go back in the history of warfare, we will find what we can describe as aspects of trench warfare in many, many conflicts over long periods of time, right back, for example, into Roman warfare. In the more recent knowledge of warfare at the time of the Great War, a century before in the Peninsular War, when British soldiers under Wellington fought the French in Spain, there were battles in which there were serious amounts of entrenchments involved in actions there. At the siege of Badajoz, for example, during the Peninsular War, entrenchments were dug beneath the walls of that citadel to enable the British to get to a point where they could lead assaults on those walls and go up and over them and into the French positions. And then in the Crimean War of the 1850s, in the American Civil War, there were trenches. There was the whole kind of development of that type of warfare. And then in the 20th century, in more recent conflicts just before the Great War, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 was a time in which, again, there were entrenchments. Whether you could say it was whole-scale trench warfare on the kind of scale that would become apparent in the First World War is another thing, but there was a history of trench warfare within the general military history, not just of Britain and its wider empire, but many nations in those centuries before the Great War. But if you look at military thinking, trench warfare was not the kind of war that anybody really wanted to fight. In the examples of those conflicts in the centuries before 1914, when men were in trenches, there could be heavy losses. Losses from artillery fire, hitting positions, killing a lot of men in a confined space. But when men were static for long periods of time, it was also an opportunity for disease to spread within those forces. And disease in conflicts before 1900 often caused as many, if not more, casualties than the actual fighting, when soldiers with poor diets and lack of fresh food and polluted water could easily get sick. And if you entrenched, if you besieged an enemy, and that's essentially what trench warfare was, then the chances that your forces would be engulfed in disease and sickness was much greater. So it was not the kind of war that anyone dreamt of and wanted to fight. In the years before the First World War, they were looking at fighting a war of movement, what they thought was a modern war. And in the British Army, the whole use of movement and cavalry had developed out of the experience of the Boer War, the Second Boer War of 1899 to 1902. And the development and the importance of mounted infantry in that conflict had led to a whole kind of rebirth of cavalry and redeployment of cavalry, not just as forces with lances or sabres to attack the enemy, but they would double up as infantry as well. So every cavalry soldier in the British Army before the war, whether cavalry, full-time regular soldiers or yeomanry territorials, were trained as much as infantry soldiers as they were as cavalry mounted troopers. So the war that people were imagining was a traditional war of armies clashing on vast open fields and manoeuvre. But that didn't mean that soldiers before the First World War were not trained to dig trenches. They were. It was part of general training, because even in a war of manoeuvre, they would get to a point where soldiers would have to dig in. So soldiers were taught to dig firing positions. Everything from what were essentially little pits in which 2 to 4 men could be sheltered from enemy fire, but then mount an earth bank within it, what would later be called a fire step, to fire over that position, to fire at the enemy who might attack where they were dug in. Foxholes, it would be called in the Second World War. That's a term that you don't really see in 1914-18. So those kind of positions, but also full-scale trenches. If you look at 1911 engineering manuals in the British Army, for example, you'll see classic, what we would see as classic trenches, zigzag patterns with whole sections of trenches being planned to defend a particular area. So there was an imagining of trench warfare. There was a training for a kind of trench warfare, but just not on the scale that the trench warfare would become in those years after 1914, particularly on the Western Front. So that while soldiers were prepared and trained to dig trenches, and this is not just within the British Army, French engineering manuals, German engineering manuals, they'd all trained to dig. A soldier rapidly found that much of his task was labouring as much as fighting. So this kind of work was pretty standard. But it was, as I say, not the imagined war that they were going off to fight when Europe was plunged into conflict in the summer of 1914. And the thing to remember about the Great War is that really everyone in Europe was prepared for war in 1914, prepared for a conflict on European soil. Plans had been made, whether it was the German Schlieffen Plan to attack the French and knock them out first and then concentrate on the Russians, or whether it was the plan to take British forces across the Channel to set up alongside the French in northeastern France. Whatever those plans were, they were there. So people were prepared for war, just not the kind of war that the First World War, the Great War as it was then, would rapidly turn into. And although when armies did clash, if we look at those early battles when the Germans swept through Belgium and encountered the Belgian army in the open fields around Liège, a whole system of fortresses had been built around that city to try and stop what became the steamroller of the German army coming through that area, a kind of siege warfare, trying to protect its borders, but still there was fighting in open fields. It was the summer, so the fields were full of crops, and there are many accounts of men moving into the waist-high crops as shells drop and machine guns fire and rifles open up at close range as soldiers, often in mass columns of troops, not dissimilar to a century before in the wars fought by Napoleon and Wellington and so many other generals. Little seemingly had changed, and in the battles of the frontiers, the French army fought in those vast open fields and were suffering staggering casualties. They were trying to fight a war of their fathers and their grandfathers, a war of movement in those big open battle spaces. But the thing that had happened between the 19th century and 1914 was the development of technology, and not just military technology. Military technology, of course, with the increase in industrial capacity to produce weapons, rifles, artillery, and the shells and the ammunition for those weapons, but also new kinds of weapons. So here in Maxim, an American who had been responsible for the design of fairground attractions that had not really earned him a lot of money, one of his friends had said to him, listen, if you really want to make money, invent a weapon that those crazy Europeans can use against each other to kill themselves. Now that's a kind of paraphrase of how that came about, but essentially it led Maxim to use the kind of methodology that he developed to build fairground rides to build and manufacture the Maxim machine gun, which he patented and then sold round the world. And it was a machine gun used by many, many nations that were plunged into that conflict in 1914. The British had a Maxim machine gun, the Germans had their version, the Russians, the Austrians. It was a standard piece of equipment, and that weapon that could use the emerging industrial technology of the 19th century, automation to move a bullet into a chamber, fire it, eject it, and then bring in the next bullet to fire it, and continuously fire those bullets to lay down what became known as automatic fire, vast numbers of rounds of bullets being fired into a given area, created the ability to cause heavy casualties. And as the use of that kind of technology developed, it could be used as well to deny the enemy entry into a space within that wider area of the battlefield. So while the machine gun was used in those big battles of 1914 and masses of French troops moving forward being hit by German machine gun fire in the battlefields of the Ardennes, in those battles along the frontiers, causing heavy casualties, it was yet to really reach its pinnacle as a weapon, both defensive and offensive, until trench warfare would come in that winter of 1914-15. But it wasn't just the machine gun. Other inventions also helped create the really kind of special conditions that led to trench warfare in 1914. And two of those were quite simple things, really. One, often described as the devil's rope, barbed wire. Barbed wire was an American invention of the 19th century used to keep cattle in areas in the vast prairies of the United States. It had been used to deny entry of troops into an area of a battlefield during the American Civil War when positions had been wired up, but it would take on greater significance in the vastness of the trench system along the Western Front. And again, industrial capacity enabled the production of barbed wire on a hitherto unknown scale, and also its design, its physical design, could be changed to create almost impassable wire, from the huge barbs that we see on German barbed wire, so close together, to what today we would describe as a kind of razor wire. There are some truly horrific photographs of barbed wire in front of the Hindenburg line, for example, where you can see these triangular shaped, razor sharp sections of wire, almost impassable, almost impossible to cut. So we've got a military weapon being developed, the machine gun, a piece of agricultural equipment, barbed wire used to hem in cattle that could also be used to hem in or keep out soldiers. And a third one, going back to what we spoke about, disease within an entrenched force. In previous examples of trench warfare, soldiers had got sick because of the availability or the lack of availability of fresh food. Canning, the canning of food, the preservation of food, something developed in particular in the 19th century, led to the availability of producing food, putting it into tins and preserving it for long periods of time so that when soldiers were on a battlefield they could open it and they could eat it, and they had something that was as good, not perhaps exactly as good, but almost as good as fresh food. And within the British Army, the most famous example of this is bully beef, corned beef, produced from vast herds of cattle in South America by the Fray Bentos Company and sold in millions of tins to Britain and its wider empire, both before and then eventually during the period of the First World War. But it wasn't just bully beef. We've had an episode on Tommy Tucker on food of the First World War, and it was other things like fruit in tins and jam and meat and vegetable stew. All of this, the canning of food, the preservation of food, enabled it to be stored and then delivered when required to troops on the front line. In a mobile war, food, of course, was an issue, but when your soldiers were entrenched for long periods of time, it was much more of an issue if you wanted to avoid the spread of disease and soldiers getting sick because they were not having the right amount of nutritional input, food into their diet to stop them from being sick. So just taking those few examples, machine guns, barbed wire, and the canning and preservation of food, already we've got factors that make trench warfare possible. And in 1914, the battles on the Western Front are fought as they had planned to fight them. The British fighting in the open fields of Le Cateau or dug in alongside canals at places like Mons, and then fighting alongside the French in the open fields of the Marne Valley, stopping the Schlieffen Plan outside of Paris. But then the Germans are pushed back. They push them back across the Marne, over the River Aisne, and beyond the Aisne are the heights that lead up to the highest bit of ground there, the Chemin des Dames, the Ladies' Way. And the Germans don't want to give up any more ground. So at that point, using their pre-war training, they dig in. They create a trench system, not joined up in the same way that other trench systems were later on, but opposite them in what rapidly becomes known as no man's land, the ground between the two sets of trenches. The British and the French dig in as well, using their pre-war acquired skills. Basic trenches, basic zigzag shaped, and we'll come on to the shape and design of trenches later on in the podcast, but very basic trenches, and we see that in the photographs of that period. The war then moves up to northern France and into Flanders and becomes a war of movement again. But when British troops arrive just outside the old medieval city of Ypres in Belgium, with the German army coming down the main road system heading towards the Channel ports, they're on the defensive once more. And defence means digging in. And some of those classic images that we have from the First Battle of Ypres shows men of the Scots Guards, for example, digging in villages along the Menin Road. Trenches are dug, firing positions are dug, but it's still a war of movement. And once the Germans are stopped, both there and in other places along that front in France and Flanders in the late autumn of 1914, the German High Command has to look at the situation on that Western Front for them. The term Western Front comes from the Germans. They're fighting in the west against the British and the French and the Belgians, and in the east against the Russians. And their nightmare was to fight that war on two fronts. And now, by the autumn of 1914, that nightmare has been realised. So what do? And they realise that all they can do without giving up everything is to dig in and dig deep. And that's when trench warfare truly begins. At the end of those battles of the autumn of 1914 and during that winter of 1914-15, the whole network of trenches on the Western Front are dug, connected up, expanded upon. New types of trenches are dug, trenches for toilets, latrine trenches, trenches for special weapons like mortars or machine guns, observation posts, sniping positions, and this is replicated on both sides of the battlefield. And you see really a good full year from the autumn of 1914 through to late 1915 of the whole development of how trenches are constructed. And if we look at what constitutes a trench, what is a trench by 1915, early 1915, for example, pre-war it would have been a system of firing trenches, perhaps connected up. This now was a line, a long static line. And they realised you couldn't just have one line of trench. Some of the early battles when one side would attack those positions that the enemy had dug, would overrun that trench. Where do those men who are in that trench go to? They need a fallback position. So what you see is the development of systems of trenches on the battlefield. Typically a front line facing the enemy, behind it a support line where you can have a fallback position for your troops to move into if the enemy overrun your front line position, and you can use that as a point to counterattack the enemy, to throw them back out of that front line, and you can have supporting troops in there to protect you if you are attacked. And then behind that you have a reserve line where you can keep more reinforcements back to counterattack, to throw the enemy back across no man's land if he takes your first and your second line positions. So you're beginning already to see the development of what became known as defence in depth. But the trenches were meant to be a temporary arrangement. They weren't accepting that this kind of warfare would go on for months and years. The idea was to build, from the German perspective, a system of trenches that were formidable. So if the enemy, as they almost certainly would do, would attack to try and throw the Germans out of Belgium, try and throw the Germans out of France, whether they be British troops, Belgian troops or French troops doing that, they would suffer huge casualties trying to break through those positions with well-sighted trenches, belts of barbed wire in front, industrial scale weaponry behind it, machine guns, rifle teams, mortars, artillery, to kill the enemies he tries to take on those German defences. And what would happen is that those armies would rapidly run out of men, lose casualties on this terrible scale, and they would sue for peace. So although Germany might not win a war decisively with a big battle or a manoeuvre in the West, it could force a capitulation of Britain and France, its two great enemies there, and then concentrate against the Russians, which was always, in two world wars, always Germany's greatest fear and biggest enemy. So where were those first trenches? As we've said, from a British perspective, the first proper trenches with a connected up system were on the Aisne, above the Aisne Valley, in September and October of 1914. The French were digging them in different parts of the battlefield along the wider elements of what became the Western Front, reacting to the conditions where they contained the Germans. The Germans had dug positions too, and in some cases, and this is something that's not often realised, the French took the war to German soil. So down in the Vosges, in the area of Alsace-Lorraine, which was part of Germany in 1914, French attacks in places like Lelange took French troops across the border onto what was officially German soil and attacked defensive trench systems there. So there isn't one specific place where you could say that's the birth of trench warfare for everyone. It's different for every nation. The Germans, of course, are kind of pushing this forward by the development of their own trenches, whether it's from the Aisne or to the establishment of a proper Western Front in that autumn and winter of 1914. But from a British point of view, trench warfare began on the Aisne, continued at Ypres, and then reacted. It was a reactive decision to dig trenches opposite an enemy who was now building a defensive line. Because if you didn't dig in, and the enemy did, and your troops ran in the open, they're vulnerable, and your casualties will mount as a consequence of it. And if we look at some of those very early trenches that the British used, some of them were drainage ditches that were already there. So you had a kind of a trench, which were dry perhaps in October of 1914, but certainly not dry by the winter of 1914-15. And we see some really truly awful conditions in those early trenches on the British front when we look at some of the photographs from that period. So by 1915, a Western Front had been formed, stretching over 450 miles from the Belgian coast down through Flanders, northern France, down to the Somme, cutting across the departments of the Aisne and the Oise, across the Chemin des Dames, down towards Reims, across the Champagne, into the Argonne forest, around the curve of the line, the salient at Verdun, down towards Nancy and onwards to Alsace, Lorraine and the Vosges, where it ended on the border of Switzerland. In fact, there was a point there where three nations joined: Switzerland, Germany and France. Kilometre Zero, it's often called, and that was the end or the beginning of the Western Front, depending on how you looked at it. So a front was formed, trenches were dug, and essentially both sides became landlocked in front of those trenches. There was no way, and people often ask this, couldn't they just go round the Somme or round Passchendaele? There was no way to do that because there were no flanks. The only flanks were the two ends of the front, the North Sea and the Channel coast at one end, and Switzerland, a neutral country with mountains, at the other end. There was no way round, and it meant you were now facing the enemy along 450 miles of siege warfare on a scale hitherto unknown, with millions of men, even in those early stages, on both sides occupying those 450 miles of the trenches. And going back to the developments within technology and industry, this is where those key elements come into play. To protect your trenches, you utilise that barbed wire, once built to contain cattle, now used to keep out enemy soldiers trying to capture your lines of trenches. You defend it with the power of your artillery, from small trench weapons, trench mortars, Minenwerfers, crapouillots as the French called them, right through to the big heavy pieces of artillery, 42 centimetre guns, the big Berthas that fired the 1 metric ton shell. That's at the other end of the scale in terms of artillery. With the British, it was a 15-inch shell, a form of naval weapon used in the initial stages by the Royal Marine Artillery. You see that being used at some of the early battles. You had guns, and behind those guns, industrial power to produce on a vast scale the ammunition that was required to keep those guns firing. And then you had the machine guns, those weapons produced by someone who had failed to make any money out of fairground attractions. Instead, he designed this weapon that was one of the ultimate killing weapons of its generation, and now it could be employed on a scale unimaginable by Maxim, to be placed along those hundreds of miles of trenches to kill men in the open space between them and to deny the enemy the ability to move across that ground, keep them in their trenches, stop them from making attacks, and then pummel them with the power of your artillery. And if you couldn't break the stalemates of those static positions, you now had the ability to keep your men in those trenches for long, long periods of time, with the employment of canned food and provisions to enable that army to eat and be free from sickness. While the physical conditions of the battlefield, the cold, the wet, the damp, the water, the snow, and everything else, caused problems for men living in what were ditches in open fields during the 4 years of the First World War. Poor diet, was not really a cause of sickness on a scale that it had been in previous wars. So those conditions, and those are just, like I say, 3 examples of it to simplify this, but you can see how those extraordinary circumstances before the war enabled trench warfare to come about, with the failure of a war of movement and then the weapons and technology and food to keep your men on that battlefield to continue with that trench warfare, that static warfare. So in 1915, the trenches were set. The whole aspect of trench warfare would develop as one side and another tried to break that deadlock of trench warfare. The British attack the Germans in Flanders at Witscharter by sending troops out into the open, barely supported by artillery, very little machine gun fire, into well-sighted, defended German positions, suffering catastrophic casualties amongst those assaulting British troops. And this leads to a realisation that just by throwing men at an enemy line, that isn't going to work. It's only going to result in heavy, heavy casualties. So in the next, and often cited as the first proper British offensive of the war, the Battle of Neuve Chapelle, which began on the 10th of March 1915, you see there a huge artillery plan to try and smash up the German trenches with all the guns they have, from 13-pounders used by the Royal Horse Artillery through to that 15-inch gun used by the Royal Marine Artillery, pounding the German lines and men going over the top, cutting the wire that they had. It's not a perfect battle, but it shows that a breakthrough in trench warfare can be achieved. But the other elements of technology that had not really been developed in the 19th century was communications, and this would have a massive, massive effect on how the stalemate of this trench warfare could be broken. So when there were situations in which a British force in this case at Neuve Chapelle, got to a position, how do they relay that back to someone behind them so that reserves kept ready to exploit a success like that could be moved forward? There were no radios, so it meant static communications, telephones, and telephones had static wires that could be cut by shell fire. Then you had signallers that had lamps and flags and other devices to send back Morse. That could be destroyed by the conditions on the battlefields. Runners could be sent, they could be killed. Pigeons could be sent, they could be gassed or shot out the sky by shrapnel or machine gun fire. So nothing in terms of communications was perfect, and it really constricted the ability of both sides to conduct and control a battle once it had begun. And what you see in 1915 on both the British and the French sectors of the Western Front is an attempt to find a new way of warfare to try and break those German positions. The Germans do it too. They use a new weapon, which is poison gas, for the first time on the Western Front against French, British and Canadian troops at Ypres in April of 1915. In the West, the birth of chemical warfare, and we've covered that in an episode on gas. But both sides spend that 1915 period trying to find a way out of this new type of warfare by developing new approaches to fighting, but as always, at a cost. If we look at the British offensives from Neuve Chapelle to Festubert and Albers Ridge and Givenchy and the Battle of Loos, we see catastrophic losses, very little breakthrough, but lessons are learnt, lessons that always come with a price, and that price is men's lives. And that's true for the French when they attack in the Artois, Notre Dame de Lorette and Hill 145, then down in the Champagne, which becomes France's deadliest period of the war in September of 1915, with the losses that were sustained in the battles there, and gradually approaches to fighting change. The French react very quickly with the development of trench weapons. Britain follows on behind. The Germans are kind of on a defensive footing for most of this period, so they're developing defensive technology, from the construction of trenches to give best possible fields of fire to inflict heavy losses on the enemy, through to the construction of concrete bunkers to house weapons inside, to shelter troops, and thicker and thicker and thicker belts of barbed wire. And throughout the rest of the war, the long period of static warfare, of trench warfare on the Western Front, 1915 into 1916 and 17, we see this grow and grow and grow. And with the construction of German positions like the Hindenburg Line, with bunkers, with overlapping fields of fire, concrete tunnels and infantry shelters, deep and wide trenches, and thick belts of wire, some of them up to 40 metres thick, we see the whole development of trench construction and technology grow and grow. And with it is a requirement for bigger and larger amounts of manpower to do that work. On the British side and on the French side, having vast colonies enables them to mobilise manpower to come and feed that war with everything that is required to dig and prepare those trenches and keep those men in those trenches. The Germans struggle with that without having an empire, so more and more of their troops become logistically based as the war goes on, and they struggle with manpower, particularly in the final phase of the First World War. But by 1916, it's clear that this is not a war of movement anymore. It's a static war. It's a trench war, and trench warfare dominates it. So both sides look to weapons, often what we could describe as wonder weapons, to try and end that conflict, whether it's super heavy artillery, or in the case of the British, the tank first used in the Battle of the Somme to try and break the static nature of trench warfare by sending a kind of movable pillbox with weapons inside it forward across the battlefield to roll over those trenches and assist the infantry in capturing those positions. So we see the development of a whole host of new weapons, from the tank through to new types of machine guns and trench mortar weapons, gas, special weapons, chemical weapons to lob down mustard gas, the development of gas, so that it would kill much greater numbers of soldiers on the battlefields, flame weapons to fill the trenches full of liquid fire. And as aircraft technology develops, aircraft going from just being used in an observation role in 1914 through to fighter and what we could describe as fighter bomber aircraft that could swoop down and drop bombs over positions, and the aircraft could be there to strafe positions and also observe them, just as important, using aerial photography, something we've discussed again in a previous podcast, to photograph the battlefield so you can see where the enemy positions were and then react appropriately with your battle plan and the weapons that you have. So in the period of 1916-17, we see in particular the British and the French developing the skills to break the German dominance of defence on the Western Front, always at a high cost, but gradually break it they do. And what we see in the battles of 1917, although the offensive on the Chemin des Dames doesn't achieve what is hoped to be achieved and results in huge losses for the French, the British fighting battles like Arras, with the penetration of the Hindenburg Line showing it was far from impregnable, and then the battles in Ypres with the capture of the Messines Ridge and the pushing back of German forces in front of the Passchendaele Ridge, and the battles of Cambrai in November and December of 1917, although that ends with a German counterattack and British troops are pushed back, what it shows with the implementation of hundreds of tanks in that battle is what tanks are capable of doing. And what we see in 1917 is the beginning of the rupture of trench warfare. The Western Front still exists, all 450 miles of it, but it becomes much more of a war of movement. And in the battles of 1918, with the German offensives on the Somme in March, Flanders in April, the Chemin des Dames in May, and the battles in the Marne in June and July of 1918, is a movement once more of the front, a breakthrough by the Germans, but they discover, just like the British and the French had done before them, that to capture grounds results in huge losses. And by this stage of the war, those huge losses are difficult for Germany to withstand in terms of holding the front indefinitely. and German manpower stretches to almost breaking point in that final phase of the First World War. But 1918 is a period as well in which those years of trench warfare and all the attempts to break through finally come together to create, particularly in the British and Commonwealth forces, with tactics and approaches to war developed by the Australians and the Canadians and many British units, leads to the creation, really, of a modern army fighting a modern battle. And we see that most clearly at Amiens on the 8th of August 1918, the black day of the German army, in which the line is ruptured along the Somme front, with the British in the north, the Australians and the Canadians and the French to the south, and the beginning of the last 100 days of the Great War on the Western Front. And in that late summer into the early autumn of 1918, the lines of trenches are rolled over once more, the Somme into the Hindenburg line, which had been fought over the year before and were now being fought over again, crossing canals and gullies and ravines and through woodland to a point where the last German line of defence was reached. In the British sector, the Beaurevoir-Fonsomme line, down in the Meuse-Argonne, as they pushed beyond the Hindenburg line, the Kriemhilde line, up towards the Meuse, and in the French sectors, so many other places besides, where the last German line of defence in the Champagne or around Verdun was broken, pushing into areas that for 4 years had been behind the German trenches. No positions had been dug there, and trench warfare was effectively over. In the British and Empire forces, from mid-October through to the last day of the war on the 11th of November, this was another new type of warfare. Static warfare had gone. They were advancing across fields, down lanes, through villages, fighting from house to house, capturing positions along a river or a canal or a bridge, and then ultimately ending in the urbanized streets of the city of Mons, where the Canadians, supported by British units, including the Royal Naval Division on their flank, got to the outskirts of Mons in the final ambers of the war and fought their last battle there in the closing moments of it on the 11th of November 1918. So the war ended, as I've seen depicted a few times in accounts of the Great War on television, not with a whistle blowing or an announcement being made and both sides coming out of trenches into no man's land and the war is over. It ended in a kind of war that hadn't been fought since 1914, and a kind of war that would be fought again a generation later in Italy or in Normandy or northwest Europe. It was not the trench warfare that had dominated the conflict for most of its duration. And if we were to somehow fly over that area of intensive trench warfare during those years from the creation of the front in the winter of 1914-15 through to the move towards a war of movements in the summer of 1918, we would see the different designs of trenches, how trenches zigzagged, that zigzag shape done to minimise the effects of shell fire. Shells in a straight trench, which would be easier to dig, and some of the early trenches were straight trenches, could drop in there and they would kill everybody in that immediate area, kill or wound them. In a zigzag trench, a shell would drop into a part of it and only kill and wound men in that particular area. The ones round the bend, the curve of the trench, would be protected by the shape of that trench design. So you see front line, support line, reserve trenches being built in that crenellated pattern, and we see that in the air photographs of the period. And linking those sets of trenches up in the early period of the war, men would come up into open ground at night and cross from one line to another, but they could be susceptible to shell fire and mortar fire and everything else, so communication trenches were dug to link those lines together, and they too were usually of a zigzag shape to again minimise the effects of fire. But that zigzag shape was not just to protect troops from enemy artillery, it was also part of the defensive nature of those trenches. Having a zigzag pattern of trench meant that you could defend it easier if the enemy got into it. So the enemy get into one part of your trench and you can hide behind those bays, as they were called, the zigs and the zags of the trenches, and then use your trench weapons, grenades or mortars, to fire into the enemy while protected by the design of your trench. So all this digging, all this design, all this construction of trenches created this vast scar over those 450 miles of Flanders to France and almost to Switzerland and Germany. But who dug those trenches? This is something that we're often asked. It took millions of men to construct the huge amount of infrastructure that was developed in those 4 years on the Western Front. And there weren't specific trench digging units. Soldiers were required to do some work on this themselves, but within the British and Empire forces, the work was done by a mixture of Royal Engineer and Pioneer battalions. If you look at every infantry division, they have a Pioneer battalion, very often recruited from the north of England. Durham Line Infantry, for example, and Northumberland Fusiliers provided quite a few Pioneer battalions. These were tough northern men used to hard labour, having worked in factories or construction projects or in the collieries, the mines of northern England. They were suitable, particularly suitable, for the amount of efforts and manpower that was required to dig these positions. So they would dig, develop, work on the trenches. The engineers, Royal Engineers, would do specific tasks like construct firing positions or work on, eventually, the tunnels that could be dug underneath the battlefield to try and blow the enemy positions up subterraneously by laying charges. And then the infantry would be the ones that would be required to work on those trenches. So when a unit was in the line, their task holding that trench system was not to engage the enemy, but to work on the positions in which they lived, repair the flooring, the duckboards, repair the sides of the trenches, because even if a shell pitched over and landed close to a trench, it wouldn't destroy it, but it would move the earth, push it, and the sides of the trench would begin to collapse. So the men within would have to repair that, push that collapse back, and use trench revetments, wobbly tin, corrugated iron, sandbags, timber, meshing, all this kind of stuff to prop up the side of the trench. That kind of work, maintenance really, was the principal task of soldiers when they were in the line. Filling sandbags, replacing sandbags, working on anything and everything that the trench was constructed of, and then being sent out the line at night to get whatever supplies were required to carry on with that work. And these supply depots built close to the trenches were an integral part of keeping those trenches in the same kind of shape that the army required the men inside them, defending them, who would attack from them perhaps, to keep them in some kind of shape by the provision of their food and their water and everything else that they required. So really, trench warfare turned the whole battlefield into this vast engine of war in which millions of men were sent, from which many would never return, and even those who did would be changed forever by the experience of trench warfare. And even in the aftermath of the Great War, when the guns on the Western Front were silent, and the Germans had marched home, and the British moved up into the Rhineland and based its troops across France and Belgium, men, even while they were still in khaki, returned to those battlefields, returned to that engine house of war that the Western Front had become, to try and make some sense of it. And in that period of the 1920s and 30s, families came there too, to see what was then the crumbling trenches of Flanders or the Somme or the Hindenburg Line, to stand amongst the wooden crosses in the soldiers' cemeteries that would eventually become vast cities of white stone, eternal places of memory for those who had fallen in those trenches of the Western Front. Trenches were and then became the symbol of the Great War and remain so today. And if one thing defined that war, it was the trenches of the Western Front, something we seek even more than a century later as we travel along now those quiet fields that were once that engine of war and are now the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline.